What if everything you've been told about losing weight is the reason your body is getting worse? You eat less, you push harder, you try to stay disciplined and still, the fat around your stomach won't move, your energy keeps crashing, and your blood sugar refuses to stabilize. That's not failure, that's a warning, because the most dangerous fat in your body is the one you cannot see, cannot pinch, and almost never measure. It builds silently around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, and begins to interfere with the signals that keep you alive. This is visceral fat, and it doesn't just sit there. It actively breaks your metabolism from the inside out. It floods your system with inflammatory signals, overwhelms your liver, and slowly forces your body to ignore insulin. And once that happens, everything changes. Fat loss stalls, energy collapses. Disease begins quietly, long before symptoms appear. And the most unsettling part is, you could be living with it right now and have no idea it's happening. Dr. Nathaniel Li has seen this pattern more times than he can count. Patients who walk into the clinic looking perfectly healthy by every superficial standard normal weight, no obvious warning signs yet, their blood work tells a completely different story. Elevated fasting glucose, rising insulin levels, early markers of metabolic dysfunction that shouldn't be there. This is where the illusion begins to break, because what you see in the mirror is not what your metabolism is experiencing. Researchers now use a term that sounds almost contradictory: too-fi thin outside, fat inside. Nearly 40% of adults who believe they are metabolically healthy fall into this category, carrying dangerous levels of visceral fat hidden deep within the abdominal cavity. And unlike the fat under your skin, this type doesn't just store energy, it actively disrupts the system that keeps your body stable. So the real problem isn't weight, it's signaling. It's how your liver responds to insulin, how your cells process fuel, how inflammation quietly rewires your metabolism without you ever noticing. You could be doing everything right on the outside while the internal system is slowly drifting off course. And once that system begins to fail, the effects don't stay hidden for long. So if it's not about how much you weigh, what is actually breaking down inside, imagine your body not as a number on a scale, but as a fully operational system. A high-efficiency facility running 24 hours a day, where your liver processes fuel, your pancreas regulates blood sugar, and every cell depends on precise timing and clean communication to function correctly. Now, picture what happens when that system starts to fill slowly, silently, with a dense, expanding foam. At first, nothing seems wrong. The machines still run. The lights stay on. You feel normal. But beneath the surface, that foam begins to wrap around critical components. It presses against the machinery. It restricts movement. It interferes with the wiring that allows signals to pass from one part of the system to another. That foam is visceral fat, and unlike the fat you can see or touch, this doesn't sit passively, it infiltrates. It surrounds your liver, seeps into metabolic pathways, and begins to distort the environment your cells rely on to survive. Over time, the system doesn't just slow down, it becomes confused. Signals that once worked instantly now arrive distorted, delayed, or ignored entirely. And this is where everything starts to shift in a way you cannot feel yet. Because once communication inside the system breaks down, your body is no longer responding to you, it's reacting to interference. But the real danger isn't the pressure, it's the signals that pressure creates. This is where everything begins to unravel, not on the surface, not in what you can see or measure with a scale, but deep within a biochemical pathway that most people have never even heard of. Because visceral fat doesn't just take up space, it behaves like an active organ. It continuously releases inflammatory molecules known as cytokines, and these molecules don't wander randomly through your body. They are delivered directly into your liver through a specialized blood pathway called the portal vein. That detail matters more than you think, because your liver is the central command center for metabolic control. It decides how your body processes glucose, how it stores fat, and how it responds to insulin. Now imagine that command center being bombarded hour after hour, day after day with inflammatory signals that distort its perception of reality. Over time, your liver begins to adapt, but not in a way that helps you. It starts to ignore insulin. The very hormone designed to regulate your blood sugar becomes less effective, not because your body stopped producing it, but because the signal itself is being drowned out. I've seen this play out in real patients. One case that stayed with me was a man in his early 40s, lean, active, disciplined. By every external measure, he looked metabolically healthy. But his blood tests told a different story. Elevated fasting insulin, rising glucose levels, early insulin resistance. He wasn't overeating. He wasn't sedentary. His system was simply no longer listening. And that's the shift most people never feel coming. Because when your liver stops responding correctly, the consequences ripple outward. Glucose remains elevated. Fat storage increases. Energy becomes unstable. And all of it traces back to a signal that was quietly disrupted long before symptoms appeared. And once that signal is disrupted, the entire metabolic system follows. For years, Dr. Nathaniel Li searched for something that could interrupt this cycle, not another medication layered on top of symptoms, not a restrictive plan that collapses after a few weeks, and not a complicated protocol that only works in controlled conditions. Because the pattern was always the same. Patients would try harder, follow stricter rules, push their bodies further, and still, the underlying system refused to stabilize. That's when the question changed. Not, how do we force the body to respond, but what signal is the body missing that would allow it to correct itself? What I began to realize after decades of watching this unfold is that the body is not broken in the way we assume. It's not a machine that needs to be overridden. It's a system that responds precisely and predictably to the right inputs. And when those inputs are absent or replaced with the wrong ones, the system drifts, slowly at first, then all at once. So the real solution wasn't about adding more pressure, it was about restoring the signal. And here's where it becomes unexpected. Because the answer didn't come from a new pharmaceutical compound or an extreme dietary overhaul, it came from something far more accessible, something most people have seen, ignored, or misunderstood for years. Something that interacts directly with the very pathways we just uncovered. And when used correctly, it doesn't fight the system, it reactivates it. And when he found it, the answer wasn't hidden in a lab. Here's where it gets interesting, because the fruit doctor Nathaniel Li ultimately focused on doesn't work through a single pathway. It engages multiple systems at once, each one targeting a different layer of the metabolic breakdown we just uncovered. The first mechanism begins with a dominant compound called oleic acid, a monounsaturated fat that behaves very differently from the fats most people consume daily. Inside your liver and fat cells, oleic acid binds to a nuclear receptor known as PPAR-alpha, a regulatory switch that determines whether your body stores fat or burns it. When this switch is activated, your cells shift into fat oxidation mode, specifically targeting stored triglycerides within visceral fat deposits. That distinction matters because most diets attempt to reduce fat globally, but this mechanism directly prioritizes the fat that is metabolically dangerous. In clinical models, consistent activation of this pathway has been associated with improved lipid metabolism, reduced hepatic fat accumulation, and increased energy stability throughout the day. But here's the twist: most dietary fats fail to activate this receptor in any meaningful way. They provide calories, not signals. And without the right signal, the system remains locked. But that's only part of the story. The second mechanism moves deeper into a system most people rarely consider when thinking about metabolism: the gut microbiome. A single medium serving of this fruit provides a substantial amount of soluble fiber, including pectin and beta-glucan, which are not digested directly by your body. Instead, they are fermented by beneficial gut bacteria into short-chain fatty acids, primarily butyrate and propionate. These compounds then travel through the same portal vein to your liver, But unlike inflammatory cytokines, they carry anti-inflammatory signals that restore insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. In other words, the same pathway that once delivered disruption now becomes a channel for repair. Studies have shown that increased populations of butyrate-producing bacteria are strongly associated with improved glucose regulation and reduced systemic inflammation. And here's where it becomes even more important. This process doesn't just improve digestion, it recalibrates how your liver interprets insulin signals. So instead of ignoring insulin, the system begins to respond again. But that's only part of the story. The third mechanism is where the science becomes even more precise and, frankly, unexpected. This fruit contains a rare bioactive compound known as Avocado B, found in virtually no other commonly consumed food. What makes Avocado B remarkable is its ability to act directly at the mitochondrial level, inside your muscle and fat cell. In metabolically dysfunctional cells, energy production becomes inefficient, leading to the buildup of toxic byproducts such as ceramides and acylcarnitines. These compounds interfere with insulin signaling, effectively blocking the message that tells your cells to absorb glucose. Avocado B disrupts this process by reducing the accumulation of these toxic intermediates, allowing the insulin signal to pass through clearly again. In controlled studies, treated cells demonstrated a significant increase in glucose uptake, restoring a function that had been impaired. The twist here is critical. This isn't about forcing insulin to work harder. It's about removing the interference that prevents it from working at all. And once that interference is cleared, the system doesn't need to be pushed, it corrects itself. But that's only part of the story. The fourth mechanism brings everything together by addressing the underlying force that sustains metabolic dysfunction, chronic inflammation. This fruit is one of the richest sources of lutein among commonly consumed foods, a compound often associated with eye health, but far more influential at the systemic level. Lutein acts as a potent inhibitor of NF-κB, a master regulatory protein that controls the expression of inflammatory genes throughout the body. When NF-κB is overactivated, as it often is in the presence of visceral fat, it drives the continuous production of cytokines that perpetuate insulin resistance. By suppressing this pathway, lutein effectively dampens the inflammatory cascade at its source, reducing the signals that initiated the breakdown in the first place. And this is where the full picture emerges. You're not dealing with a single malfunction, you're dealing with a network of disruption. And this fruit doesn't target just one point. It addresses the system as a whole, layer by layer, restoring communication where it was lost. This isn't theory. This is what researchers actually measured in controlled clinical settings using tools designed to detect changes you cannot see on a scale. In one randomized study, adults with excess abdominal fat were assigned to include a daily serving of this fruit while maintaining their usual calorie intake. Body composition was assessed using DEXA scanning dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, the gold standard for distinguishing visceral fat from subcutaneous fat. What changed wasn't overall weight. It was the fat that matters most. Participants showed a measurable reduction in visceral adiposity, particularly in women, without a corresponding drop in total calories. At the metabolic level, the data becomes even more compelling. In separate trials involving individuals with features of metabolic syndrome, daily intake was associated with significant improvements in fasting insulin and HOMA-IR, a clinical index used to quantify insulin resistance. In practical terms, that means the body required less insulin to manage the same amount of glucose. That's not cosmetic change, that's a shift in how the system functions. And then there's the microbiome. Studies tracking gut composition alongside dietary intervention found increased abundance of butyrate-producing bacteria, organisms directly linked to improved insulin sensitivity and reduced inflammation. The system didn't just respond, it reorganized. So the question is no longer whether it works, but how to use it correctly. Dr. Nathaniel Li doesn't just explain the science, he applies it. And what he found is that the difference between results and frustration often comes down to precision, not effort. The protocol is simple in structure, but exact in execution. Start with 1 full medium avocado per day, approximately 200 grams, divided across 2 meals. Half should be consumed with your first substantial meal, and the other half with your largest meal of the day. This timing matters because the combination of soluble fiber and oleic acid slows gastric emptying and blunts post-meal glucose spikes, reducing the insulin demand that reinforces resistance. Next, add fresh lemon or lime juice to each serving. The citric acid helps stabilize lutein during digestion and increases its bioavailability, allowing more of the compound to reach systemic circulation. Without this step, a portion of that anti-inflammatory potential is lost. Then, include 1 teaspoon of extra virgin olive oil. This is not for flavor, it introduces oleocanthal, a compound that works alongside lutein to suppress inflammatory signaling, creating a synergistic effect that strengthens the pathway we discussed earlier. Equally important is what you pair it with. Consume the avocado alongside high-fiber foods such as legumes, leafy greens, or cruciferous vegetables. This provides the microbial substrate needed to accelerate butyrate production in the gut, reinforcing the gut-liver axis reset. If fresh fruit isn't available, frozen avocado is a viable alternative. It retains the key bioactive compounds when properly thawed. Finally, pay attention to detail. Scrape the darker green layer closest to the peel. It contains significantly higher concentrations of lutein. Avoid refrigeration before ripening, as cold temperatures disrupt the enzymatic processes that enhance nutrient availability. Because how you use it determines whether it works at all. What happens next is subtle, but powerful, because the first changes don't show up where most people are trained to look. You won't see them immediately on a scale, and you won't feel them as a dramatic overnight shift. Instead, the process begins quietly internally where the real problem started. Within the first 72 hours, your gut microbiome begins to respond. Populations of beneficial bacteria start to shift, increasing the production of short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, and for the first time in a long time, your liver begins receiving a different kind of signal, not inflammatory, not disruptive, but stabilizing. By day 7, something else starts to change. Your energy becomes more consistent. The sharp crashes between meals begin to fade. You may notice that you're not thinking about food as often, not because you're forcing discipline, but because your system is regulating itself more efficiently. This is not willpower, it's physiology correcting course. Around day 21, measurable metabolic changes begin to appear. Fasting insulin levels often start to decline, and your body becomes more responsive to the insulin it produces. This is the point where many people expect dramatic visual changes, and when they don't see them, they begin to doubt the process. But that's the mistake. Because between 6 to 12 weeks, the deeper shift becomes visible. Visceral fat begins to decrease, waist measurements change, and metabolic stability improves in a way that a scale alone could never capture. The system is not just reacting, it is rebuilding. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. Even with everything we've covered, most people still get this wrong. Not because the science is flawed, but because the execution quietly breaks the very signals you're trying to restore. The first mistake is underdosing. People add a few slices here and there and expect a systemic effect. That's not how biological signaling works. The mechanisms we discuss depend on reaching a threshold, enough oleic acid, enough fiber, enough lutein to activate the pathways consistently. Without that, nothing locks in. The second mistake is relying on the scale too early. In the first 1 to 2 weeks, your body is shifting internally. Glycogen, water balance, and lean tissue hydration all change. Weight can stay the same or even increase slightly while visceral fat is already decreasing. If you judge the process by the wrong metric, you abandon it before it starts working. The third mistake is pairing this with sugar. Smoothies loaded with sweeteners, avocado toast drizzled with honey, Flavored yogurts, you're activating insulin spikes at the same time you're trying to restore insulin sensitivity. That contradiction cancels progress. And the fourth mistake is inconsistency during the first 14 days. The microbiome requires stable, repeated input to establish change. Interrupt the signal, and the system resets. Which brings us to something even more important. So let's bring this full circle, because by now you can see the pattern more clearly. This was never just about fat, and it was never about how hard you try. It's about whether your body is receiving the right signals to function the way it was designed to. For years, we've been told that metabolic decline is inevitable, that as you age, your body simply slows down, becomes resistant, and eventually breaks. But that narrative is incomplete, because what we're actually seeing is not failure. It's miscommunication. Your cells are still capable. Your liver still knows how to regulate glucose. Your metabolism still has the machinery to burn fat efficiently. But when inflammatory signals dominate, when key pathways remain inactive, and when the inputs your body depends on are missing, the system adapts in the only way it can. It becomes resistant. Not because it's broken, but because it's responding to the environment you've created. So this isn't about genetics. It's not about your age. It's about signaling. And when you change that signal, the system changes with it. And that leads to a truth most people never hear. Dr. Nathaniel Li has seen this transformation happen again and again. Not in people with perfect genetics, not in those with unlimited discipline, but in ordinary individuals who made a single shift consistently, quietly, and often without realizing how powerful it was. Because what separates those who continue to decline from those who recover is rarely dramatic. It's not a breakthrough moment or a radical overhaul. It's the repetition of small, precise decisions that send the right signal to the body day after day. You don't need to fight your biology. You don't need to override it. What you need is to understand it and then work with it. Because your body is not your enemy. It's not trying to resist you. It's responding exactly the way it was designed to, based on the inputs it receives. And when those inputs change, the response changes with them. Gradually at first. Then, unmistakably. I've watched patients who once struggled with unstable energy, rising blood sugar, and stubborn abdominal fat begin to regain control not through extreme measures, but through alignment with their own physiology. Their systems didn't just improve, they recalibrated. And what seemed inevitable before decline, resistance, progression, began to reverse direction. So this is not about luck. It's not about being the exception. It's about whether you are giving your body the signals it needs to repair, regulate, and restore itself. Because those pathways are still there. They haven't disappeared. They've been waiting. You don't age because time passes. You age because your body stopped repairing in the dark.